All right, good morning. Welcome to virtual breakfast this morning. We've got some exciting things to share with you. My name is Michelle Sweeten. I'm from the Eastern Upper Peninsula, a field forage and livestock crops educator. All right, and I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Alex Lindsey. He's an assistant professor at The Ohio State University, and he's done some research and is going to be doing some more on managing corn and nitrogen after waterlogging. So Dr. Lindsey, welcome. Let you share your screen now.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with your group this morning. I am a Michigan native. I don't know if you can see behind me. There is some Michigan State paraphernalia, but it's been relegated right now to the back bedroom because my wife is a Buckeye born and bred, and now both of us are working at Ohio State. But we're doing some work that may be relevant to a lot of you all here in the state of Michigan. Recent storms have been increasing, and overall precipitation has also been raising for parts of the Midwestern states. Days that are workable for field work in the spring have been shrinking in part because of these heavy rain events. And so some of the questions that have been arising here in Ohio is how do we manage corn better under flooding conditions? And how do we deal with nitrogen application in those situations as well? When we think about corn and managing it with regards to standing water, it really begins before emergence and after planting. So if we get flooding that occurs after planting but before emergence, it can be pretty stressful for the seeds. But some of the stress and intensity of the stress is dependent on the temperature at which it's occurring. If we have standing water and cooler temperatures like 60 degrees Fahrenheit, for example, in past work that's been published in peer-reviewed papers, it suggests that you can get about 80% emergence under these conditions if there was no flooding that occurred. And after 2 days of flooding, you could still expect to get about 70 to 80% emergence and around 70% even if you had 4 days of standing water. But if you have higher temperatures after planting while that seed is covered in water, it can be a lot more dramatic as far as reducing emergence and affecting seed survival. After about 2 days of flooding at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, researchers have reported a 30% reduction in emergence. And if that extends to 4 days, emergence can drop to 10 to 30%. This is a case that we saw in 2022 at Northwestern Ohio at our research station. We had standing water in this field for about 3 to 4 days. I came out after it dried out, trying to dig up to see where the seeds were. I was able to find them in the soil. They had imbibed, but you squish them and it just oozes out, resulting in really stressed emergence for the ones that actually came up and many skips and gaps in that research trial. We ended up losing an entire rep because of that standing water situation. So how do we manage for this condition? We really need to alleviate standing water as fast as possible from those fields, improving surface drainage or eliminating the amount of standing water and duration that standing water exists. And potentially, if the seed has survived that flooding event, you may need to use some sort of surface tillage to break up any soil crusting to further improve emergence uniformity if at all possible. The surface tillage may be more important if the flooding occurred under cooler temperatures. If it was warmer, replanting may be a better option in the event that you want to replace that stand with corn again this growing season. So if the corn has come up, there is greater yield loss in corn when flooding occurs at the early to mid-vegetative stages as compared to later vegetative into reproductive stages. So kind of that early emergence, early stand period is pretty detrimental. Around the V4 to V6 growth stage, if you can get flooding for 4 days or so, you can probably expect 20 to 30% yield loss in those situations. If it extends for more than 5 days, 30 to 100% yield loss has been reported in past work. If we fast forward to kind of more the flowering or grain fill period, 8 days of flooding really can produce almost no change in yield in some cases, but you can expect maybe up to 20% yield loss. The flooding occurs for 8 days or less. So the older corn gets, the more resilient it becomes to standing water conditions. So the issue with standing water is not only that it could affect the physiology of plants and their ability to grow and delays growth, but it also causes issues with nitrogen availability. So with nitrogen availability, when we think about this, the of the leaching can occur in sandier soils when we have excess water or flooding because it's a negative ion, and sandy soils tend to have a lower cation exchange capacity and just lower nutrient holding capacity in total. If we get over to the eastern part of the state in the thumb where we get our heavier soils or clayier soils, our bigger concern with flooding is the loss of nitrogen as noxious species, nitrous oxide, or possibly even full denitrification towards nitrogen gas. And so there's the compounding issue of corn damage from a physiology standpoint, but also a limitation on availability of nutrients in the soil due to the flooding conditions. One question that came about in Ohio was, we know that nitrogen is lost under standing water conditions, but is it even worth applying it after a flood? Is the corn too damaged to take it up? So we started a study to look at this in 2017 and repeated it in 2018 at 3 Ohio locations. All of these were silt loam soils. And what we observed was that when we flooded corn for 2, 4, or 6 days, that's what these lines are here, we saw overall a yield reduction, and pre-plant nitrogen improved yield when we had 2 days of flooding, but not for 4 or 6 days. So that's kind of what we're seeing here on this first chart, indicating that it's possible that the pre-plant nitrogen was lost before the plant could fully take it up and utilize it for yield production. But for 2 days, we still had some nitrogen remaining, though not as good as our unflooded control. In all cases, we ended up applying 60 pounds of nitrogen post-flood to see if the corn could take up that remedial nitrogen. And in every case, we saw a yield increase, with the most dramatic increase coming after 4 days of flooding. So the corn was responsive to that 60 pounds of nitrogen, but then the question was, okay, it did respond from a yield perspective, but was it worth it economically? And basically the same pattern was observed when we used 37 cents per pound of nitrogen and 350 corn. Again, this was a few years ago, but those economics did suggest that a remedial nitrogen application was going to benefit the crop long range. So this was really great. And it was exciting for me as a researcher to be like, okay, yes, it does make sense from an economic standpoint and an agronomic standpoint to address the nitrogen deficiency, even if you had some flooding. But then the question was, is 60 pounds the right amount? Would plants respond to a greater amount, or was the damage too severe to take up any more than 60? And if corn does respond to higher nitrogen rates, is it economically viable? So we recently wrapped up some work that was conducted over the last 3 years at 2 Ohio locations. We had a Northwest Ohio location in a clay loam soil and kind of an East Central or Northeast location here in our Worcester research station. For our nitrogen treatments, we did use a pre-plant nitrogen application of either 100 pounds or none applied. And then we had 4 rates of post-flood nitrogen, 0, 60, 120, or 180. For our flooding treatments, we changed them a little bit. We had a non-flooded control. We had a flooding treatment which experienced 3 days of flooding. But we know that in a lot of our fields, if you get flooding once, you're probably going to get it again, especially given the frequency of our rain events. So we actually did a 3+3 treatment, which is where we flooded the field for 3 days. We let it dry out for 3 days, came back, applied 3 more days of water. So in total, it was flooded for 6, but it wasn't 6 consecutive days of flooding. So I'll refer to that as our 3+3 treatment moving forward. So the combination of flooding and nitrogen was the main goal, to see if we could hone in on what's the right rate if you have waterlogging in your field. And what we saw was actually pretty interesting to me as a crop ecophysiologist. I studied the interaction of management and crops and how we can address those in the face of changing climatic conditions. And what we saw was that yield responses to side dress were initially greater when that corn experienced flooding for longer, possibly due to a greater loss of that pre-plant nitrogen value. And on the whole, flooding across all durations ended up reducing yields by about 25%. It was a little bit less when we flooded corn for a little bit less time, but on the whole, yield did go down with flooding. But regardless of our flood treatments, yield increased with nitrogen rate, and there wasn't a water duration or waterlogging duration by nitrogen rate interaction, which suggests that it's possible our nitrogen rates that currently are used in non-flooded conditions still apply even if you had flooding occur. Looking at the economic optimum nitrogen rate, we found that for this site, our clay loam soil across these 3 years was typically achieved with about the 220 pounds total applied nitrogen, which 100 pounds of that nitrogen was applied as pre-plant, 120 was applied as post-flood nitrogen. In our silt loam soil, we had better drainage, so there really wasn't an effect of yield in this particular study. And our economic optimum nitrogen rate ranged anywhere from 120 to 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre applied as side dress. At this location, the pre-plant really didn't benefit, and it was the post-flood nitrogen that was more critical to preserving yield at this location. Now, I do apologize, the yields, the units for these graphs that we were seeing is all in kilograms per hectare or dollars per hectare. I did change it in the text to apply to standard units that we're more familiar with, but this student just defended about 2 weeks ago, so I haven't had time to convert those charts. The other question with regards to nitrogen management in corn is related to the source that we're planning to use. Are some sources more prone to loss under waterlogging than others? And would use of a nitrogen stabilizer benefit that system to prevent losses and preserve yield better than if we weren't using one of those stabilizers? So we decided to standardize our treatments by applying 200 pounds of nitrogen pre-plant incorporated. And we looked at a variety of different dry sources. We used plain urea, urea treated with a urease inhibitor, urea treated with a nitrification inhibitor. And then we used kind of a biological slow release as well, where we applied urea mixed with dairy manure solids, which we assumed 30% mineralization in the first year. And it comprised about 20 pounds of nitrogen total, with a balance of 180 pounds of that nitrogen coming from our urea. We also looked at a polymer-coated urea in comparison. We had 3 liquid nitrogen treatments of 28% UAN, UAN with the urease inhibitor and UAN with the nitrification inhibitor, and we also had an unfertilized control. So again, the point was to look at flooding for 0 or 4 days with a variety of different nitrogen sources to see if any held up to the flood conditions or help preserve yield better than the others. At both locations, we did see an effect of flooding on yield. We saw a 28% reduction in our clay loam soil when it was flooded for 4 days across nitrogen treatments, a 10% yield reduction across nitrogen treatments at our silt loam location. And by and large, it seemed like the treatments that were more dry in nature, our urea, polymer-coated urea, and urea plus the nitrification inhibitor, held up better from a yield perspective as compared to some of our other treatments. We saw the lower yields as compared to those treatments in our clay loam soil with regards to UAN treated with different stabilizers, as well as our urea plus manure treatment. It's possible the flooding affected how quickly that manure was mineralized and resulted in some of that yield penalty. In our silt loam soil, it seemed like most of our treatments were fairly good compared to one another. The only one that didn't work as well across our flooding durations was the UAN plus urease inhibitor, which is possible that this one just didn't perform as well from a yield perspective. So when looking at yield perspective, it seemed like it didn't really help adding a nitrogen stabilizer. But when you add a nitrogen stabilizer, it may not necessarily just be about yield preservation, but also minimizing nitrogen losses in those systems. So we decided to look at these under more controlled conditions, and we actually conducted a greenhouse study where we could actually capture some of that leachate that's coming out of those systems. And in the complementary greenhouse study, we applied the same rates of nitrogen, pre-plant incorporated, but we focused solely on the dry fertilizers. We didn't really have a good way of applying the liquid to these smaller gallon pot studies. But what we saw was that when we collected leachate over a period of 4 days of flooding from all of our treatments, the urea plus nitropyrin treatment, the nitrification inhibitor, resulted in similar leachate values to our non-fertilized control. So it's possible that the nitropyrin was helping to minimize nitrogen losses in the form of leachate, even if we didn't necessarily see a yield benefit from its utilization in our field study. So that could be a good idea for using that moving forward. So, okay, so this was some good information. I feel like it's good information, but then what are the main takeaways to synthesize all this down? I think my recommendations based on the work that we've been doing and the work that we've seen is that current maximum return to nitrogen values for nitrogen applications are likely still adequate, regardless of whether you're going to be experiencing flooding or not. But it seems like the post-flood nitrogen may be more critical and impactful on yield recovery as compared to applying all of that nitrogen pre-plant. Again, looking at the yields from our northwest site, when we had flooding, those yields were pretty low, roughly 97 bushels per acre. But it's possible if we applied more as side dress post-flood, that could be a way to help increase yield in those situations. So all of our flooding studies did take place between V4 and V6. And it's possible, though, if flooding occurs at a slightly different time frame, that could affect some of these decisions. Again, if the corn is too tall to come back into side dress, applying pre-plant incorporated may be the best option in those situations. It seemed like dry sources resulted in greater yields across flooding treatments at our northwest location, and were competitive with most of our liquid treatments at the other location as well. But this was more or less just an anecdotal situation here. Other studies have found similar results. Other studies have found no difference in sources as well. But our results also indicated that nitrification inhibitors may be reducing leaching in some of our situations. So if environmental stewardship is key for reducing nitrogen losses, that could be a management decision that would be worth making. So I'm happy to take questions, but I think we're going to have some time at the end. So just a point of clarity here, flooding and is basically you have saturated soil conditions and partial coverage of the plant. Waterlogging is basically solely saturated soil conditions where you may not have as much coming over. So I was using those terms interchangeably. I'm sorry for not defining those a little bit sooner in the presentation. Okay.
I think it's time to get to some questions, and we're going to start with one for Dr. Lindsey. It looks like he answered this one online. He was wondering about the degraded soil, and I'll just read this unless he wants to say something about it.
Yeah, the question was about the fields in our pictures looked kind of degraded. These were all on research stations, so I don't think they would classify as degraded soils, but they were experiencing conventional tillage prior to corn planting, usually spring tillage to level out the field, which is fairly common practice for Ohio producers. We also wanted to facilitate incorporation of our nitrogen treatments so that we didn't have, I know sometimes ESN can float on water and move away. So we wanted to make sure to get that incorporated to minimize surface level losses of that product. But we haven't looked at flooding and nitrogen management intensively in no-till systems and ones that have incorporated cover crops. We do have a cover crop study with our flooding work where we're looking to see if cover crops accelerate soil drying prior to corn planting when we have spring flood events. But we've actually just finished applying our last flood treatment and are collecting our final year of field data, so I can't really speak much to those results at this point. But we haven't really looked at nitrogen management, flooding in no-till and cover crop systems to date.
All right, our next question, Dr. Lindsey. thoughts on optimum N rates if 0 N is applied pre-plant and flooding occurs?
That's a great question and something that we've looked at a little bit with our project here. And I think when we isolate out and looked in our rate study, we also looked at not only the full rate applied of the pre-plant plus the side dress. We decided to look at what if we just looked at the pre-plant versus no pre-plant and looked solely at the side dress rates across all of the pre-plant values. And in general, the nitrogen recommendations that we still have tend to hold true. Kind of that 180 is kind of where we were seeing yield maximizing, even in the event we had waterlogging occur in our systems. So again, that's kind of going back to that idea that our MRTN values still seem to hold true, that kind of the range that we currently recommend using the MRTN calculator tends to hold true whether we've had the waterlogging occur or not in Ohio based on what we've been seeing.
Okay, and one more question for Dr. Lindsey here. Is the UAN less effective than dry due to 25% already in the nitrate farm?
That is a possibility. So for the source study that we were looking at, we essentially applied those. We staked out our field plots. We hand applied the nitrogen or backpack applied the UAN treatments. Removed our initial flags, incorporated the nitrogen products using tillage, shallow surface tillage using a disc, and then came back, reflagged the plots, and then planted into those fields. We didn't apply the flooding then until kind of that V4 growth stage. So there was some time for the dry fertilizers to mineralize before flooding occurred, but it's possible that what happened prior to our flood implementation could have been affecting to some degree the differences that we were seeing, but it's without doing further investigation, it might be a little bit challenging to see.
And another question for you. How would anhydrous affect the corn if it's waterlogged?
That's a good question. And we were initially hoping to look at anhydrous and waterlogging, but we didn't really have the applicator or ability to do that within the current studies, which is why we were kind of relegated to the UAN or urea treatments. But that is something that we've been wondering. If we think about it from an application standpoint, you're injecting a liquefied gas into the soil. If the soil is a little bit wet at the time of application, if you don't get proper closure of that injection furrow, you could have some escape of that ammonium product as ammonia to the atmosphere. But also, I think some of the effect on the mineralization potential or the conversion from ammonium to nitrate, the nitrification potential may be influenced a bit by the flooding, but it's hard to tell. We haven't done the studies to really look at that at this point in time, unfortunately.
All right, and I just wanted to make a note that I did put, Dr. Lindsey sent me some fact sheets that I put in the chat early on, so I know he needs to get going here pretty soon. We do have one question. I don't know if you have time for that. Okay.
Yep.
But that's all we have for you right now.
Okay.
So thank you very much. We appreciated the information.
Sure thing. Thanks for the time. Best of luck weathering the weather this year. And yes, the question about pro-nitro-DN, I did not look at that. We were limited on the number of treatments we were able to utilize. So we wanted to look at one urease inhibitor and one nitrification inhibitor. And those were the ones we were able to source and utilize for the study. There may be other researchers that have looked at a wider suite of some of these, but these were the two stabilizers that we focused on for our research efforts. Okay, thanks again. I think I'm going to sign off. I got to take my son to preschool today. So best of luck to you all in the planting progress. Hopefully it dries out well enough where you can have a successful planting season and continued efforts into the growing season. Thanks for the invitation as well.
All right. Well, we'll continue. Our other specialists have a few things they would like to share. Dr. Martin Shilvers, the MSU pathology crew is looking for wheat fields to sample for a virus survey, and there is a link in the chat for that as well.
Mm.
And I believe Chris DeFonso would like to talk to us as well. Chris, are you
See if
still
I can
there?
share. Yeah. Can you see the screen?
Sure. Yep,
Okay.
that looks
So
good.
just a quick note about black cutworm. I had a question yesterday about black cutworms and their flight north and how come they're not there, are they in our fields or not? And that would be a combination of two things. One, if you're kind of weedy and they're going to egg lay. So if you're in the thumb where most places seem to have gotten some planting done and the weed control is pretty good, then you're probably okay. But talking to Ned Berkey down in Monroe County, he said they're very weedy and things aren't going in and their herbicides aren't on. And so that's the kind of location where you could potentially have some black cutworm infestation, but then you got to have the moths themselves have flown up here. So I'm showing you a picture of the current Great Lakes trap catches, and each of those dots is a trap. If it's black, that means it's caught something. It's caught a black cutworm. So in the Lansing area, you see I have my little trap there. An intensive trap capture would be 7 per night over a week. So that'd be like almost 50 moths in a whole week. And you see that on this whole trap network, Wisconsin does a great job. We've got some in Michigan, Ontario, and Ohio that have been entered. There's only a couple traps that are the dot is really big and black, which means that there's been an intensive capture there. And look how patchy that is, especially in Wisconsin, where there's I don't know, maybe 30 traps there, and you've only got 3 that had an intensive capture. So these moths go up, they fly up. They're not intentionally thinking, I'm going to Michigan today. They're flying around looking for places to egg lay, and they get swept up and carried along on Jeff's fronts that move north in a particular way, and then they kind of rain out over something. And you see there's these isolated areas in Wisconsin and over in Ontario where there's some intensive trap captures and then nowhere else. So that's pretty typical where you get these isolated areas where you have some deposition of moths and maybe some potential to get an infestation. The next slide, this is true armyworm, and you're seeing the same thing. We don't trap as much the true armyworm. This is a little different because they will infest wheat, so they don't need weeds necessarily to get going. They could be in wheat fields, and the only high trap captures so far have been a couple of traps in Wisconsin. So I'll stop my share there. Again, we can blame Jeff for most of this because his weather fronts are transporting these things, and whether you get them or not, then you have to have the weeds there to support, at least for black cutworm, to support their um, egg development. I think that's about it. There's some alfalfa weevil out there. I found some on campus this morning. They're probably third instar, third stage. I didn't see a lot of feeding damage, but there's weevils there. And I sent out a Fons fax last week after the uh, breakfast with some advice on that. So if you're not on my email list, I'll put my email into the chat, and then you can email me and say, yes, I want to receive your rando emails, and I would be happy to add you to the list.
Chris, Nicole had a question, and everything's added to it, about wheat aphids. And she's starting to see them in fields. And when should they treat and when should they let them be?
So, so far, the species we found is Rhopalosiphon patti, which is a bird cherry aphid. It's so early that I suspect that this is overwintering here as eggs. I have never seen a wheat field, except in North Dakota many years ago, that would need to be treated for aphids. It's very rare. They're there, and I think a lot of good bugs will start in on using aphids early as food and then move into some of your other crops. So I can't remember the threshold, but there's really good sampling where you sample a certain number of stems and then you look at the aphid number and you can continue or not. But I've never seen a field here that would have been over threshold in like 20 some years. So,
Great.
and so we would expect English grain aphid soon. That will be flying up here. And then you can also have cornleaf aphid. And then you'd have I forgot the name. So there's a green bug can also come up. So there's a few more aphids to go.
All right. And Phil had a question about growing degree days and the alfalfa weevil. Do you want to just ask that one, Phil?
Sure. So as we're starting to see growing degree days increase, Jeff, can you correlate whether the growing degree days and Chris's information on the alfalfa weevil are coinciding, or are we seeing the model not really fit for what we're seeing in the field so far this year?
I'd have to refer back to either you or Chris, because I haven't looked at the actual data recently, but what status or what did you see from the model?
Keith has information in the chat.
Oh.
He's saying light feeding is estimated at 300 degree days at base.
Base 48 is what that model runs on. The
thank you,
alfalfa
Keith.
weevil. Sure, yeah. And we have the alfalfa growth model at 41. So
right.
Yeah, so I guess 42 is a kind of a good estimate in the middle there. But yeah, I ran the model using one of the most southern stations, Cassopolis, and it showed that that we should see some light feeding now in that area. But major feeding probably is going to start actually in the next couple of days is what it looked like. So that's kind of what the model predicts. I haven't been in any alfalfa fields, that's for sure. So maybe, I don't know if Chris has any.
No, that feels right to me, because on campus this morning, my net had quite a few in there, and they weren't the biggest stage yet, which does probably 80% of the eating. So at that point, I'm more the type of person, rather to look at the degree days, I'd rather just go in the field and see what's actually there. But if you have fields that are far away and you don't know, you could do that. I actually haven't been able to load the EnviroWeather site for a few days, and I don't know if there's some weird glitch in there. So
it's probably a browser issue. Quite often, their cookies are a problem. So
yeah,
if you want, I can walk you through how to delete cookies. And
no,
that.
I know how to do that, but a lot of the MSU websites are starting to do that. So it's
yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I think it's something that's kind of system wide at MSU, but yeah.
Troy Jenkins says he is finding weevils in cold water. And I don't know if any of our other specialists have anything they would like to share this morning. If so, please unmute yourself.
Just, I guess, one last thing. Remember, cutting is always better than spraying for weevil. So we can keep those beneficials in the system if it works out. As far as Kim, I think Kim would say that that would be a wise thing to do. She would agree with me. Not if it's too small, but if you have enough there and you have a little bit better quality, but your yield to be a little bit less.
On the wheat disease front, the head scab model, I know we're a little early, is showing low risk at the moment. And we've also been watching for stripe rust. But stripe rust so far has really just been popping up in southern Illinois and today in Nebraska. So it doesn't seem like that's going to be an issue like it has been in the past for us. So, yeah, that's the update. And if you have any wheat fields that you'd like us to survey for wheat viruses, please fill out that link that I put in the chat there. That'd be really helpful, and we'll get those results back to you.
Teresa found some weevil and damage April 30th in Richville, Michigan. And then also Jason asked and I don't know if anybody knows this, is there a date set yet for the MSU Weed Day?
Yeah, this is Christy. It is set for June 26th.
There we go. Thank you, Christy. All right, I think we're all set. Thank you so much. Everybody's eager to get outside. Hopefully the weather's nice for you wherever you're at in the state. And we'll see you next week. Thank you.